Okay, so this video we're going to talk about the 3, maybe 4, and you'll see why I put maybe 4. Okay, so the 3, maybe 4 types of unemployment. Okay, so following the preceding video when we're talking about the stock flow model and everything, right? We might want to understand why people are unemployed, right? So why are people moving from employed to unemployed? Why were they making that shift, that EU, right? Why were they doing that? Okay, and so understanding why specifically people are unemployed would also help inform us into making good policy prescriptions and recommendations. Okay, so the first type of unemployment is called frictional unemployment. Okay, and this is sort of short-term, temporary unemployment. You are literally just like between jobs. Okay, so you're just between jobs. You're not really worried about finding your next job, right? You're confident that you'll get a new one relatively easily, and you're correct, right? You'll find a new job pretty simply. So a salesperson who gets fired is probably not going to have a difficult time finding a new sales job, right? A waiter or waitress who decides to quit his or her job at one restaurant is probably not going to have a terribly difficult time finding a job at a new restaurant, right? These are all examples of frictional unemployment. It's short term, you're just between jobs, right? Some people will actually just say like they're going to quit their job. They just can't stand their current job, and they know they're worth more, or they're worth better than what their current boss is paying them, and so they quit their current job without having secured a new one because they know that they'll find a better job relatively quickly. Okay, and so frictional unemployment, again, is just short-term, temporary unemployment. Okay, and it's characterized by sort of the following frictions. Okay, so people. I'm summarizing the stuff on Blackboard. People don't know what jobs or employers are out there. Right? So in other words, the information about what jobs are available and what employees are available is not perfect. We don't know. No one knows everything about all the job markets and everything, right? And so as a result, employers are going to have to search for employees, and employees will have to search at some level for employers, right? And so these would all be frictional cases of unemployment, right? It takes time. So that search takes time. Right, so it takes time for employees to find new employers. It takes time for employers to find new employees, right? And then the last one would be sort of random fluctuations. Right, so there are cases of random fluctuations in employment. People, suddenly leaving, or suddenly having a high opportunity cost. So maybe someone wants to, maybe a family has a child, and one of the parents decides to stay home, right? Well, that would cause frictional unemployment, not because that person stays home, right? They would be exiting the labor force, but because there'd be a job opening that isn't filled. Okay, so there's lots of stuff going on in here, in frictional unemployment, but the basic idea is that it's short term and it's temporary. Okay, and so so if we think about finding a job as sort of a probability, so there's 85% chance that you'll find a job today, and there's 85% chance that you'll find a job on any given day, right? the higher that probability is, right? So the higher the probability of unemployed people finding jobs, the lower the unemployment rate will be. Okay, so that's basically reducing, points frictions 1 and 2. We're raising the probability of finding a job, which means it's reducing the amount of time, and we can raise it by providing people with more information about what jobs are there and what employees are there. So LinkedIn, Monster.com, these type, Big Rapids, HelpWanted.com, right? These are all means of reducing these search costs and raising the probability that an unemployed worker will find a job, okay? Or a worker or an employer with a vacancy, it raises the probability that they will fill that vacancy quickly, okay? Now, there are external and internal determinants to this frictional unemployment. So an external determinant would be something that affects the probability of finding a job that you cannot, you as an employee, control. Okay, so an external determinant, again, is something that affects the probability of finding a new job that you as the employee cannot control. Okay, so in 2007, right, 2007 to 2009, right, the unemployment rate was very high because the economy as a whole was not exactly doing all that well. Okay, so things like that, things that are external that you have no influence over, those would be external sources of, or an external determinant of the unemployment rate. And internal determinants would be some things that you can control. Right? So, for example, how hard you work. Right? Showing up on time. Staying late. Etc. Right? These are all things that you actually can control. So these will, if you do these things, if you work hard, if you show up on time, if you stay late, things like that, if you do those things, the probability of you losing your job will go down, and the probability of you finding a new job, if necessary, will go up. Right? And so these are our internal determinants to finding a job. Okay, so some examples of policies that can affect both external and internal determinants would be like taxes, right? So imagine we tax part-time workers. We have a salary tax, right? So or an income tax is probably the more common name, right? So if you have an income tax on part-time workers, right? What that does is it makes it more expensive to employ part-time workers, and as a result, the unemployment rate among part-time workers will increase, right? Just because it's more expensive to hire them now. And so if we wanted to reduce the unemployment rate caused by this, we might suggest lowering taxes, lowering the taxes, right? Unemployment benefits may reduce the effort that someone puts forth in finding a job, which would affect like an internal determinant, right? So how hard you work, again, is internal, and it's affected by things like policy, right? And so we want to make sure, one thing we want to make sure is that policies that we adopt don't encourage people to not find jobs, right? If we have a program that's designed to help people get from the time they lose their job to the time they find their next job, we want to make sure that that program isn't expanding that time, right? We want to make sure that we're making sure that they're safe, comfortable, fed, sheltered and such between jobs. but we don't want to make it so that the time between jobs increases, right? We don't want to make so to be crass, right? We want to make sure that they are comfortable, but not too comfortable. If we make unemployed people too comfortable, they might stay unemployed for a longer amount of time. Okay. The second type of unemployment is called structural unemployment. Okay. This is whenever there's a mismatch between the skills that employees have and the skills that employers want. Okay, so it's a mismatch between the skills that employees have and the skills that employers want. Okay, so a couple examples of this. When the automotive industry adopted automatic or automated welding machines, the demand for skilled welders decreased because now we're using machines to do that instead. And so employers no longer valued the skills of the people in welding, right? And so, but even though they had those skills, they weren't as valuable, okay? Now, one thing you might be saying is like, okay, well, if a machine can take my job and be more productive than I can be, one thing that I could do is offer to work for a lower wage. Excuse me, very sorry about that. Right, so if I lose my job to a machine, one thing that I could do is work for a lower wage. So I lower the price that I'm willing to work for, and as a result, maybe I can make myself cheaper and more cost-effective than the machine. Okay, but the problem here is that many people have what are called sticky wages, which is a thing that Keynes, a guy named John Maynard Keynes, made famous and popularized. Okay, so John Maynard Keynes points out that in the context of wages, workers are oftentimes not willing to take a pay cut simply because, especially in the downward direction. So we're perfectly willing to have adjustments in our wages going upward, right? We're perfectly happy getting a raise. But if you try to reduce my wage, right, well, I'm not going to be happy about that. Right? And employers may also be hesitant to reduce wages because reducing wages might affect employee morale, right? And so sticky wages sort of prevents downward adjustments to wages, right? But it's at least plausible that if I lost my job to a machine, I could offer to work for a lower price. Okay. It's also the case that maybe it's the case that spot welders are no longer as in high demand in, let's say, Detroit as they once were, but maybe they're going to be in really high demand in New York City, right, where they're constantly building new buildings and they need welders, right? And so maybe we want to have people move from Detroit over to New York City, right? And in that way, they would reduce their unemployment rate by finding a job in a different city. Well, as we discussed last week, it's costly and at least at some level annoying to have to move, right? You have to move to a new city, you have to give up your friends and family, right, and your community support systems, not to mention just paying the monetary cost of a move, right, including all the costs of moving and the transaction costs involved in buying and selling a home, right? And you might not know that there's a job waiting for you in this new city, okay? So when we design a policy to address sources of structural unemployment, right, we want to be cognizant of all of this, right? We don't want to make it less costly to remain in one city relative to moving, right? We want to be able to say, like, hey, you can't find a job where you currently are. Maybe there's somewhere else in the country that values your skills highly enough to be worth moving to. And so if we had unemployment insurance that only pays you the money to be in the city, well, all of a sudden now you might stick around in the city. And so one thing we might want to do is say unemployment assistance can now be used anywhere in the country as soon as you lose your job, right? Then we're not affecting people's willingness to move, at least through policy, right? And so there's lots of other solutions here as well. Okay. The third type of unemployment is called cyclical unemployment. Right? And this is unemployment caused by the business cycle. Right? So in a recession, or at least in like a bust period, right, employers probably want to lay off some workers because no one's buying their product and they don't need to produce as many, right? This is the standard stuff from Principles of Macro Econ 221. Okay, but what we can do, right? So how can we fight this? How can we fight cyclical unemployment? Well, really, the only way that we can fight it is by smoothing the business cycle through fiscal and monetary policy, right? Just like we talked about in Principles of Macro. There's other stuff in here about real wages and solutions to sticky wages. So imagine that you're earning $1,000 per week, and demand for your service falls such that you should be paid something like $500 per week, right? Well, it turns out, thanks to those sticky wages that I mentioned up here, which are also a factor down here, so let's rewrite it. Right? Those sticky wages might prevent cyclical unemployment from ending. And so one thing that we can do is actually use expansionary monetary policy. So in the example, you were paid $1,000, which is a nominal term, and you should be paid $500, which is also nominal, right? And so what we can do is double the money supply such that $1,000 tomorrow is worth $500 today. And that would actually get us down to you making the real wage of $500. And the interesting thing is that there's lots of empirical studies on this, and which seem to suggest that people have sticky wages for nominal wages, but they don't have sticky wages for real wages, which is an interesting phenomenon. And so the point here is that if the real wage needs to decrease, one way we can do that is by expanding the money supply, which will leave the nominal wage unaffected, but reduce the real wage. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that because it's more of a macro concept than it is a labor economics concept. But I'll leave it there. If you have questions, please, by all means, feel free to email me. Okay? And then the last one, which I sort of count, but not really, so this is the maybe, is called seasonal unemployment. And seasonal unemployment has to do with, you guessed it, the changes in the season. So for example, winter versus summer. Okay. So in the winter time in Michigan, right, there's lots of business for snow park groomers, right, or snow hill grooming, right, working on the snow hill or ski hills, right. In the summertime, there's not, right. There's not very many snow groomers driving around Boyne Highlands in July, Okay, but there probably are a lot of them in December and January, right? And at the same time, there's probably not a whole lot of boat washing activity happening in northern Michigan in December. But I happen to know from personal experience that there's lots of it happening in June, July, and August, right? Because people ride their boats or go boating in the summer and they go skiing in the winter, right? And these are independent of business cycles, right? So it doesn't matter how great the economy is in July. Boyne Highlands is not going to hire a person to groom their ski hills because guess what? No one's skiing, okay? And it doesn't matter how bad the economy is going in July, there's probably going to be some work somewhere for someone to wash a boat in northern Michigan. Okay, so seasonal unemployment is just changes in is unemployment caused by changes in the season. Frankly, I think it belongs more as a subset of frictional unemployment, which is why I say there's only 3 types of unemployment. But other people say that there's 4 types, and seasonal deserves its own type. Now you are now aware of the 4th type, so when you see seasonal, you'll know what it means. But really, I view it just as frictional unemployment, wearing a different, colored shirt or something, right? So to me, there's no real difference between seasonal and frictional. Seasonal is just a type of frictional. Okay, but here's like an interesting question. So why would workers accept a job in an industry where they knew in advance they would be unemployed for a portion of the year, right? So one answer comes from the existence of unemployment insurance benefits, which reduce the burden of being unemployed. Okay, so maybe you collect on insurance during the part of the year where you're not working. Maybe you don't, right? Alternatively, maybe you're willing to work the job, the summer job, because you know that next summer you'll be hired back, right? And so basically you're working like a dog, right, or like crazy for 3 months out of the year, and then during the other 9 months of the year you live off of what you've saved, right? And so another thing that's interesting is that seasonal employment, because of its temporary nature, tends to pay more than its year-round counterparts, right? It tends to pay more because it's literally just for a little bit of time, right? It's a temporary thing. And so they tend to pay more to sort of compensate you for the fact that it's temporary. They have to compensate you for not finding, year-round work, right? Because if you had the option of a full-time year-round work versus full-time seasonal work, most people would probably pick, for the same wage rate, most people would probably pick the full-time year-round work. And so typically seasonal employers will pay their workers more money per hour than comparable excuse me, comparable year-round employers. Okay,